All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into chapter 18 of the Quran. It's called The Cave, and even if you're not like a scholar of Islam or anything, this chapter, it has all these stories and parables that get you thinking about like faith and human nature and all the choices that we make.
Yeah, it's really interesting how these stories, they're so connected to, their religious context, but they still speak to these universal themes that people in all different cultures and different times can relate to.
Right. It's like right at the beginning, there's this story of a group of young people who are believers, and they go into this cave to hide. They're trying to escape persecution, right? They fall into this deep sleep, and when they wake up, they have no idea how much time has gone by. It's like totally a time warp, But the thing that always sticks with me is it mentions that there was a dog with them the whole time.
Ugh, that detail about the dog. Yeah, it's like, they didn't just throw that in there randomly. It's highlighting, I think, that even when you're isolated, even when you're going through something really intense, companionship and loyalty are so important. It adds like this emotional layer to the story, It makes you feel for them even more.
I mean, could you imagine waking up after who knows how long, totally disoriented, but at least your dog is right there with you. Makes you think about what's really important when you strip everything else away, faith, companionship, being able to bounce back from tough times.
It kind of makes you question how you think about time too, right? Like maybe time isn't always this straight line. Maybe it can stretch and bend depending on how you're looking at it. I think that's something a lot of us can relate to these days when it feels like time just flies by.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so then we move on to this parable of the two gardens. This one really spoke to me, I gotta say.
Oh, yeah, it's a powerful parable. You've got these two guys. One is rich, really boastful, and the other, he's not as well off, but he's super grateful for what he has.
So this wealthy guy, he's just consumed with all his stuff. Like, he ends up losing everything. And then he's left with, nothing but regrets. It's like a classic cautionary tale, right? Be careful what you wish for.
Right, like material things, they don't last forever. The parable seems to be saying that what's truly valuable is things like gratitude, humility, and realizing that everything is a gift in the first place.
Makes you think about your own life, right? What do you consider true wealth? Are you chasing after things that disappear, or are you focusing on what really matters?
That's the big question, isn't it? Maybe it's appreciating the simple things, the things that money can't buy, realizing that material possessions won't make you truly happy in the long run.
For sure. So now the chapter takes us on this totally different journey with this powerful ruler, Zul-Qarnayn. He's traveling all over the place, meeting different people, facing all these challenges. And the really interesting thing is, the text doesn't actually say who he is. Like, his true identity is up for debate.
It's true. It's kind of like a historical mystery, which makes it even more intriguing. Some scholars, they think he might be Alexander the Great, with all his conquests and being so famous. Others think he could be Cyrus the Great from Persia, a king known for being tolerant and just. It's fascinating to think about.
And one of the most memorable parts of the story is when he builds this massive wall to hold back Gog and Magog. They're like these figures that represent chaos and destruction, like this ultimate threat to society.
Yeah, and that really makes you think about how power is used, right? I mean,
Right.
Zul-Qarnayn uses all his knowledge and resources to build this wall, which is protecting people from this destructive force. But it also raises these questions like, how should we, as individuals or as a whole society, deal with things that we see as threats? Do we just build walls both literally and figuratively, or do we find some other way to deal with these challenges?
That is a question that is as relevant today as it was back then, right?
Yeah.
We're still figuring out how to deal with things like security, power, and how to navigate a world that's full of, complexity and potential danger.
Absolutely. And woven through all these stories, whether it's the people in the cave or Zul-Qarnayn's journey, there's this recurring idea of Allah's power and mercy.
Yeah, it's like this underlying theme reminding us that there's something bigger going on, even in the midst of all the chaos and uncertainty of, human existence.
It's not just about power, though. It's also about acknowledging that this power should go hand in hand with mercy and compassion. The chapter emphasizes that Allah is always willing to forgive, that his love for humanity is limitless, and that we should seek guidance from him.
So we've got these captivating stories about, like, time travel, the downsides of wealth, and a leader who takes on chaos head on. What would you say is the takeaway for someone listening to this chapter, maybe for the first time?
I think it's an invitation to think deeply, to reflect. Like to really think about things like, what is time? What does true wealth mean? What does leadership look like when things are tough? And how important is it to surrender to something bigger than ourselves? These are like universal human experiences that go beyond any one culture or religion.
It's amazing how these ancient stories can feel so relevant to what we're going through today, right? Like we might not be living in caves or building giant walls, but those underlying themes of resilience, gratitude, searching for meaning, those are things we can all relate to.
It really shows the power of storytelling, doesn't it? These narratives, they've been passed down through generations because they tap into these fundamental human questions that we all wrestle with no matter who we are or where we come from.
Yeah, totally. And speaking of those timeless questions, there's this really interesting story in this chapter about Moses, that Moses and his journey with this mysterious guide.
Oh, yeah. That one's full of symbolism, lots of unexpected twists and turns. Moses is on this quest for knowledge, and he meets this wise figure who agrees to teach him, but warns him that he might not be able to handle the journey.
I remember thinking, oh, this is going to be good. And it was.
Right. So they set off on this journey together, and the guide starts doing all these strange things. Like he damages a boat, he kills a young boy, and he fixes a wall without asking for payment. Moses is like, what is going on? And he starts questioning everything.
Like a real test of faith and patience.
Exactly. It's as if the guide is pushing all of Moses's buttons, forcing him to confront his ideas about good and evil, about justice, about how the world is supposed to work.
And of course, at the end of the journey, the guide explains why he did all those things. Like he damaged the boat to stop a tyrant from taking it. The boy he killed was actually going to become a burden on his parents, who were believers. And the wall he fixed was hiding a treasure for 2 orphans.
Yeah, it's a profound reminder that sometimes what looks like bad luck or even cruelty can be a form of divine intervention, Like it's guiding us towards something good that we might not be able to see at the time.
Kind of like saying, trust the process, even when it doesn't make sense.
And that's a hard thing to do, isn't it? To have faith in a higher power and to accept that there might be a plan, even if we don't understand it right now. But the story of Moses and his guide, it's encouraging us to do exactly that, to have faith, even when things seem confusing or don't make sense logically.
It's a beautiful message, surrendering to the bigger picture, even when it feels uncomfortable or uncertain.
It's a powerful message, one that's woven throughout the entire chapter. And speaking of powerful messages, there's one more key point we should touch on. How much emphasis is placed on Allah's power and mercy, especially when you consider the consequences for those who reject faith?
You're bringing up a pretty intense topic. The chapter does talk about a fiery hell for those who don't believe, which can be, a bit heavy.
Yeah, it's a serious reminder that our choices have consequences. And those consequences, they don't just end with our life on earth.
But even with those warnings, there's still this constant message of hope, right? Like Allah is always ready to forgive people who truly repent and turn back to him.
Absolutely. It's not about scaring people or judging them. It's about showing that Allah's mercy is so vast that it even reaches those who have strayed from the right path. It's encouraging believers to stay on the path of righteousness while also assuring them that forgiveness is always possible for those who sincerely seek it.
It's like this balance between being accountable for your actions and knowing that there's always a way back if you choose it.
Exactly. This message shows up in different faiths and philosophies, too. This idea that we have free will to choose our own path, but there's always the possibility of forgiveness and renewal.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, from those time-traveling sleepers to a prophet's journey full of symbolism, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack.
Definitely. It's like peeling an onion, these stories. The more you dig in, the more you find. And the great thing is, each person might discover something different, something that speaks to their own experiences and what they believe.
Absolutely. And speaking of different perspectives, there's another really interesting story in this chapter that I want to talk about. The story of the man with 2 gardens. It's like a parable within a parable.
Yeah.
And it asks some really interesting questions about gratitude, humility, and what it really means to be wealthy.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It really challenges how we think about what it means to be blessed and how easy it is to forget what's truly important. Yeah, it's like this little example of the things we've been talking about, like being arrogant, thinking material things are everything, and not realizing that everything we have is a gift.
Right. Okay, so there's this guy, he's super rich, has these 2 incredible gardens. I mean, he's got it all, fruit trees, crops, tons of shade. But instead of being thankful, he starts bragging to his friend who's not as wealthy. He's even like, there's no afterlife, so this is all there is, and look at all the stuff I have.
It's such a classic example of pride and feeling entitled, right? He's totally blinded by all his possessions that he forgets where those blessings even came from, and he ends up pushing his friend away in the process. You get the feeling that he's built his whole identity around being wealthy, and he can't imagine losing it.
It's almost sad, you know? He's so focused on what he has that he totally misses the things that really matter, like his relationships, being grateful, being humble. Of course, because he's so arrogant, it leads to his downfall. Something terrible happens to his precious gardens, all his wealth is gone, and he's left with absolutely nothing.
It's a harsh lesson, but an important one. It reminds us that material wealth can vanish in a second. It also shows us how important it is to be humble and remember that everything we have is a gift.
It makes you think about how we measure success and worth in our own society. Like, do we focus more on possessions or things like character, kindness, and compassion?
That's something to think about. This parable seems to be saying that real wealth comes from the things that can't be taken away, our relationships, our values, our connection to something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. Okay, switching gears a little, the chapter also talks about this really interesting idea about being mindful of what we say and do, especially when it comes to promises. There's this verse that warns us about saying, I'll do that tomorrow, without adding, if Allah wills it.
Oh, that's a beautiful reminder about inshallah, which means if God wills it. It's not about being passive. It's more about recognizing that even when we have the best intentions and plans, we're part of something bigger. There are forces outside of our control that can influence our lives.
Do you think it's hard to find that balance? Like knowing when to take action and when to let go?
I think we all struggle with that in different ways. It's about finding that sweet spot between taking responsibility for what we do and understanding that we're not in control of everything. It's about surrendering to a higher power, trusting that there's a plan, even when we can't see it.
It reminds me of that saying, man plans and God laughs. It's not meant to be mean, but more like a gentle reminder that we don't always get things right, and that's okay.
Exactly. It's about approaching life with humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers. And that connects back to the idea of faith and trust in Allah's plan, which is a big part of this whole chapter.
It's like saying, I'm going to do my best, but I'm also going to go with the flow, knowing that there's something bigger guiding me.
You said that perfectly. Now, before we finish up this deep dive, there's one more interesting part of chapter 18 we should talk about. Gog and Magog. Remember them. They represent these forces of chaos and destruction that threaten civilization.
Yeah. I remember thinking, are those the same Gog and Magog from other stories? And it turns out they're not unique to the Quran.
That's right. You see figures like Gog and Magog in different religious and mythological traditions, like Jewish and Christian texts. They often represent chaos, barbarism, or enemies that threaten order and stability.
So it's not just a random detail in the story. It taps into this human fear of the unknown, the things we can't control. And it makes you think about how societies deal with threats, whether it's by building physical walls like Zulkarnain, or through things like diplomacy, or even spiritual confrontation.
Exactly. It speaks to this basic fear of the unknown, the uncontrollable. And it raises questions about how societies handle those perceived threats. Do they build walls, both literally and figuratively, or find other ways to address those challenges?
It makes you wonder how we define threats in our own time, right? What are the things that represent chaos and destruction for us today? And how are we responding to them?
That's a great question to consider. Are we building walls or bridges? Are we turning to fear and division, or are we trying to understand each other and cooperate? These are questions every generation has to grapple with. It's interesting to see how they're dealt with in these ancient stories.
So we've explored these stories about time travel, the problems with focusing on wealth, what it means to be a good leader, and surrendering to a higher power. But beyond all those stories, what do you think is the main message of chapter 18? What would you say is the takeaway for someone who's been listening to this with us?
I think it's an invitation to look deeper than the surface, to really think about what these stories are trying to tell us. It's about understanding that even old texts like this can speak to our modern experiences, that they offer timeless wisdom to help us through life's challenges.
It's like saying, don't just read the words, feel them. Let them connect with you on a personal level. See how they relate to your own life, your questions, and your search for meaning.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes studying these texts so rewarding. There's always something new to discover, a fresh perspective to consider. It's a journey of exploration and self-discovery.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dives into chapter 18 of the Quran. It's been an incredible journey, filled with thought-provoking stories, deep insights, and a reminder that ancient wisdom can still feel very relevant in our world today.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to explore all this. One thing that really struck me about this chapter is how it uses stories and metaphors, to
Right.
get across these complex ideas about like theology and philosophy. It's like it's trying to make these profound concepts understandable for everyone, no matter their background or how much they already know.
Right. It's not just like throwing a bunch of rules and doctrines at you. It's inviting you to think about these stories and figure out what they mean to you, to connect with these deeper truths in a personal way.
Exactly. And that brings me to kind of a final thought to leave you with. We talked about how Chapter 18 uses these stories to explore themes of resilience, gratitude, searching for meaning, all these things that are part of being human. But what other stories, like myths or cultural narratives from different parts of the world, have those same themes?
Ooh, that's a good question. It makes you think about how these fundamental human experiences show up in so many different ways across different cultures and times. Like, are there stories from Greek mythology maybe, or Native American folklore that have similar ideas about faith
Mhm.
or facing tough times or the consequences of what we do? It's like a treasure hunt for meaning, trying to find those connections that we all share.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that wisdom and insight can come from unexpected places, that these universal truths go beyond specific cultures or religions. So I'd encourage you to explore those connections to see how the themes we've talked about today show up in other stories you come across. Think about the books you read, the movies you watch, even the conversations you have. Where do you see those same ideas of resilience, gratitude, or that search for meaning popping up?
It's like we're all part of this giant interconnected web of stories, each one showing a different side of what it means to be human. And by really thinking about those stories, by exploring how they're connected, we learn more about ourselves, our world, and all the things that influence our lives.
I like that. And I think on that note, it's probably time to wrap up our deep dive into chapter 18 of the Quran.
Yeah, it's been an incredible journey, and I hope you've gained a new appreciation for these stories and the timeless wisdom they hold.
As always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop searching for a deeper understanding.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.